I supposed the United States will always be unready for war, and in consequence will always be exposed to great expense and to the possibility of the gravest calamity when the nation goes to war. This is no new thing. Americans learn only from catastrophes and not from experience. Our Army and Navy, and above all our people, learned some lessons from the Spanish War and applied them to our own uses. During the following decade, the improvement in our Navy and Army was very great, not in materiel alone, but also in personnel, and above all, in the ability to handle our forces in good-sized units.
If Theodore Roosevelt's assessment of the state of the Army at the time of the Spanish-American War sounds harsh, it is no worse than that of the U.S. Army's Center of Military History.
In the spring and summer of 1898, thousands of enthusiastic volunteers, a few with some militia training, but most only raw recruits, poured into the newly established camps in the South. But a taste of military life in the training camps soon curbed the enthusiasm of most volunteers, for there they found chronic shortages of the most essential equipment, even of such basic items such as underwear, socks, and shoes, a steady diet of badly prepared food, unbelievably poor sanitary conditions, inadequate medical facilities, and a lack of up-to-date weapons. A similar general inefficiency characterized the War Department's conduct of actual operations against Spain.
Although the American military soundly defeated the Spanish, the deficiencies of the Army organization were clear. This was also a time of advancements in weapons, communications, and transportation. If America was to have an active role in the world, it would need to modernize its Army. At the start of the new century, the Army went through significant organizational and administrative changes to eliminate the widespread inefficiencies of the U.S. War Department. And it would have to do it quickly, because although they didn't know it, war was coming soon. A war beyond anything the world had known before. The man tapped to steer these changes was Elihu Root, Secretary of War under President McKinley and then President Theodore Roosevelt after McKinley's assassination. Root identified three main areas in need of reform: the branches and schools, the command structure, and the National Guard. A third of the regular Army officers had no military education. Secretary Root, in 1901, announced a new, comprehensive system of officer education. It was composed of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the General Service and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and 5 special services schools. In 1904, the Army added post schools for instructing enlisted men. The Army schools, except in West Point, were supervised through the Army War College. The next area that Root saw needing reform was the National Guard. Over its history, the National Guard, which can trace its roots to militia units that existed before the nation's founding, contributed substantially to victories in major wars and minor battles. But over the 19th century, the state-based system of militias had become a disorganized, inconsistently equipped and trained, unwieldy force. At the time of the Spanish-American War, the president had the authority to call for troops, but each state determined how it would meet its quota. Usually, the governor would call for the National Guard units to volunteer, but they were under no legal obligation to do so. Many refused, and many who did volunteer failed their physical exam. States met their quota then by recruiting civilians who, despite their personal courage, were not prepared for war. In 1903, Congress acted to institute reforms identified by Elihu Root, which would give the federal government a larger role in the system. The Militia Act of 1903 addressed some of the weaknesses of the state militias. The President would now have the authority to call up the Guard for 9 months of federal service rather than 3. A few years later, the act would be amended to remove any limit to the service. Guardsmen were required by law to answer the President's call, and states were required to organize, equip, and train the Guard according to the standards of the regular Army. In 1916, as World War I raged across Europe and the U.S. seemed increasingly likely to become involved, the National Defense Act would complete the conversion of the haphazard state militias into a well-trained, fully equipped, reserved force of the U.S. Army. The act gave the War Department the authority to determine the type and number of units for each state, and required guardsmen to take an oath of loyalty to the federal as well as to the state government. The act also greatly enlarged the nation's military force, authorizing a peacetime regular army of 175,000 men to be enlarged to almost 300,000 in wartime. Meanwhile, the size of the National Guard was quadrupled to 400,000 citizen soldiers obligated to respond when the President called, though the Guard would still answer to the governor as their commander-in-chief at all other times. The 1916 Act created a new Reserve Officer Training Corps program to establish training centers for officers at colleges and universities. Changes were also made to the criteria for the nation's highest combat award, the Medal of Honor. To further raise the bar for that highest award, in 1918, Congress created the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star in response to a recommendation from General Pershing. He pointed out the need to recognize actions that were valorous but not above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor would now be reserved for the most extraordinary examples of valor. Henceforth, the Medal of Honor would only be bestowed upon individuals in the Army, Navy, or Marines who distinguished themselves conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their lives above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in armed conflict. Despite the tightening of the rules, 119 men would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their valorous actions during World War I. Before that war, the U.S. Army had the opportunity to test some of its organizational improvements on a smaller conflict in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution was spilling over into the U.S. Angered by U.S. support for a rival, Pancho Villa, a former Mexican general and former governor of Chihuahua, now led a guerrilla army in a series of attacks along the border. In response to a raid on March 9, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson ordered Brigadier General John J. Pershing into Mexico. Although the Mexican government itself wished to capture Villa, it soon protested the presence of the U.S. Army within its borders. Hunting Villa became much more difficult, and within a few months, Wilson had called for 75,000 National Guardsmen to help police the border. Pershing was unable to capture Pancho Villa before being called to a larger task, the war in Europe. But they were able to bring an end to the violence along the border, and the event provided an excellent opportunity for regular Army and National Guard troops to train together in the field in intense conditions. The experience would help prepare them for what was to come. That war had been grinding on for 3 years while America sought to remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson had been re-elected in large measure because he had kept America out of the war. But Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare pushed Wilson and the nation too far. But although America had a small standing army, the overall population was only 90 million strong, larger than Britain and France combined. In May 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, and the Army grew quickly. The U.S. Armed Forces sent to Europe to support Britain and France were named the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, under the command of General John J. Black Jack Pershing. At that time, Pershing had already had an extraordinary career. He fought with the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry Regiment at San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War, and was personally promoted to Brigadier General by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905, skipping 3 ranks and over 800 senior officers. His effort to capture Pancho Villa was unsuccessful, but in the process, he pioneered the use of truck convoys to deliver supplies. In 1917, he was made a full general by President Wilson and put in charge of organizing, training, and supplying the rapidly expanding AEF. During World War I, Pershing would serve as a mentor to the great generals of the Second World War. Men like then Colonel George C. Marshall, one of Pershing's top assistants. Marshall was a key designer of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, a massive joint AEF French Fourth Army operation that helped bring the war to an end. This was part of a grand offensive beginning in the late summer 1918 to smash through the Hindenburg Line, a vast network of German defenses in northeastern France. The German High Command believed the Hindenburg Line could not be broken. It included trenches, concrete bunkers, and heavy belts of barbed wire, tunnels for troop movement, and all were anchored by machine gun emplacements. The machine gun defined the terrifying, bloody, and wasteful experience of World War I. The Americans had gotten the ball rolling on machine guns with the Gatling gun, used near the end of the Civil War. But although this was the first continuous firing gun, it was not truly an automatic weapon, as it required a person to turn a crank to load the cartridges. That changed with the 1884 invention by Hiram Maxim, an American-born British inventor. The Maxim gun was originally used by British forces during colonial wars in Rhodesia, South Africa, and Nigeria. Armies were initially slow to adopt machine guns due to their tendency to jam. American forces continued to rely on the Gatling gun until finally abandoning it in 1911. But gradually, the armies of Europe and the American Navy began incorporating the machine gun into their forces. During World War I, the American forces primarily had to use machine guns provided by their French allies. But late in the war, a small number of heavy machine guns designed by the legendary firearms genius John Moseph Browning made it to the front. Browning was one of the most highly regarded gunsmiths of the 20th or any other century, and designed a number of reliable, effective arms used by the U.S. during the war. The M1917 Browning machine gun was only issued to the last units shipping out to Europe, but it would prove its worth in World Wars I and II, and continue to be used in Korea and Vietnam. The M1917 was a heavy machine gun, firing 450 30-06 cartridges per minute. Browning also made a light machine gun, the M1918 Browning Automatic Rifle, or BAR. Although, like the heavy M1917, it would see only limited use in World War I. The BAR would eventually become the backbone of U.S. forces in World War II and Korea. Weighing about 16 pounds, the BAR brought automatic firepower to the squad level. The vast networks of trenches along the Western Front, anchored by death-dealing machine guns, led to the development of yet another tool of war, the armored tank. Back home, Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower trained tank crews in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On the Western Front, the British, followed by the French, took the lead in developing tanks during the war. During the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, Colonel George Patton, another of Pershing's protégés, commanded American-crewed French Renault tanks. Tank support helped push back German forces at the Battle of Saint-Michel, but during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, 2 weeks later, poor roads rendered the tanks ineffective. One unit participating in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the newly organized 93rd Division. The 93rd was an all-black division organized in December 1917 at Camp Stewart, Virginia. The division included the 369th, 370th, 371st, and the 372nd Infantry Regiments. All 4 regiments were loaned to the French, who were in desperate need for troops to replace their losses. This was considered a temporary arrangement, but it lasted through the end of the conflict. The men of the 371st Regiment were draftees from South Carolina. They arrived on the Western Front in April 1918 and began training with the French. In the summer of that year, they served as part of the French Fourth Army and participated in the occupation of the Verdun sector. In September, the 371st moved with the rest of the French Fourth Army to take its role in the Allies' final major offensive. This was a joint operation with the American Expeditionary Force's First Army under Pershing. By its actions in this offensive, the 371st earned honors from both the French and American forces. The regiment as a whole was awarded the French Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. 10 individual officers and a dozen enlisted men were also decorated with the American Distinguished Service Cross. And the grandson of a slave, Corporal Freddie Stowers, would show such valor that he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. In the early morning of September 28, 1918, what was to be the last day of his life, Corporal Freddie Stowers served as the squad leader of Company C as they prepared to take Hill 188 in the Champagne-Marne sector. Corporal Stowers' Medal of Honor citation describes what happened next. With extraordinary heroism and complete disregard of personal danger under devastating fire, he crawled forward, leading his squad toward an enemy machine gun nest, which was causing heavy casualties to his company. After fierce fighting, the machine gun position was destroyed and the enemy soldiers were killed. Displaying great courage and intrepidity, Corporal Stowers continued to press the attack against a determined enemy. While crawling forward and urging his men to continue the attack on a second trench line, he was gravely wounded by machine gun fire. Although Corporal Stowers was mortally wounded, he pressed forward, urging on the members of his squad until he died. Inspired by the heroism and display of bravery of Corporal Stowers, his company continued the attack against incredible odds, contributing to the capture of Hill 188 and causing heavy enemy casualties. The Argonne Offensive continued, and in the next phase, another American soldier would also demonstrate valor above and beyond the call of duty and be awarded the Medal of Honor. Like Stowers, this man was a corporal. The world remembers him better, however, by his later rank, Sergeant York. Alvin York wrote of his actions on October 8, 1918. As a memorial in the French village of Châtel-Chehery states, armed with a rifle and pistol, he silenced a German battalion of 35 machine guns, killed 25 enemy soldiers, and captured 132. Stowers and York were both citizen soldiers who registered with the Selective Service and answered the call when America went to war. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was a success. The Hindenburg Line was broken, and on November 11, 1918, the Germans signed an armistice agreeing to a ceasefire. The Treaty of Versailles would end the war in 1919, though in truth, the peace would turn out to be just a pause for the nation to raise another generation to put into uniform. In recognition for his service, General John J. Blackjack Pershing would be promoted to General of the Armies of the United States, the highest rank in the armed forces. The rank was created especially for Pershing, though in 1976, George Washington would be posthumously promoted to the same rank, but with over a century's seniority to Pershing, so that no one would ever be able to outrank the nation's first commander-in-chief. And as for the soldiers, as the Center for Military History writes, units overseas were brought back just as rapidly as shipping space could be found for them. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the U.S. Army had over 3.7 million men. Within 9 months, almost 90% were demobilized. By the end of 1919, active forces were reduced to fewer than 20,000 officers and a little over 200,000 enlisted. In 1920, Congress amended the National Defense Act of 1916, putting in place the three-component system of the Army: the standing regular Army, the National Guard, and the organized reserves. The 1920 National Defense Act also established the Army Air Service, which would transform over the decades to eventually become the Air Force. The act also eliminated the Tank Corps as its own organization, moving it back to the infantry. During the Second World War, America's tanks were designed either to support infantry operations or traditional cavalry operations. They lacked the firepower of German and Russian models, but their reliability, particularly the M4 Sherman tank, and the nation's ability to produce them en masse made them invaluable for infantry support. Major General Adna R. Chaffee, Jr., called the father of the armored force, saw that mechanized infantry would dominate the next major war. In 1931, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur directed all branches to mechanize, but the process was costly and slow, with many still believing horses were far superior to trucks and tanks. But improvements in vehicle design continued, and as America entered World War II, the horse was replaced by jeeps, motorcycles, tanks, and trucks. U.S. soldiers would also be going to war with improved weapons. The new model 1918A2 Browning automatic rifle, BAR, was the perfect light machine gun. It no longer featured a semi-automatic firing option. It fired only in full automatic. The M1918A2 also had a skid-style bipod mounted at the muzzle end of the barrel to improve stability. Two other Browning guns served as the medium and heavy machine guns of World War II. The .30 caliber M19 Browning machine gun was air-cooled with a perforated barrel shroud rather than a water jacket that had been used on an older model. With the .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, John Browning completed the trifecta of America's light, medium, and heavy machine guns of World War II. The M2 was similar in design to the M1919, but used the much larger .50 caliber cartridge developed at the same time as the gun. But most infantrymen were not carrying machine guns. During World War II, they were carrying the weapon that General George S. Patton, Jr. called the greatest battle implement ever devised, the M1 Garand. In 1935, MacArthur finished his tour as Army Chief of Staff and became military advisor to the Commonwealth Government of the Philippines. The U.S. had maintained forces in the Philippines since 1898, including a substantial number of Filipino units. Yet only Manila Bay had adequate fortifications. MacArthur was still working for the Philippine government in 1941, organizing the new Philippine Army. With limited resources, the forces were neither as well trained nor as well equipped as he would have liked. In July of '41, President Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active services in the U.S. Army, making him Lieutenant General and named him Commander of U.S. Armed Forces in the Far East. The Philippine forces were incorporated into the U.S. Army, and MacArthur prepared for invasion from Japan. But an invasion that no one expected to happen did in just a few short months. It was understood at the time that if America entered the war, it would focus the bulk of its resources on defeating Germany first. Forces in the Philippines would be focused on the Bataan Peninsula, with the result of the Philippines reluctantly sacrificed. On December 8th, the Imperial Japanese forces struck the air base on the Philippines. There's been much finger-pointing and blame over the years regarding why the planes were on the ground when word of the bombing at Pearl Harbor had already spread. But regardless of the reasons, the Japanese were able to destroy over half of the Far East Air Force's planes on the first day of the war. With air superiority attained, the Japanese land forces began initial strikes on December 10th and a full-scale invasion on December 22nd. The inadequately trained and poorly equipped Filipino forces were unable to hold the invaders back. MacArthur's troops were forced to defend their shrinking territory on half rations. No help could get through from the U.S. James Cowan, a mechanic with the U.S. Air Corps, wrote later,
"There was no doubt in my mind that Bataan was to be our last battle. With the Japanese virtually in control of the South Pacific, I could see no way we could receive help. The other thing we could do was to fight as long as possible, slowing up the rampaging Japanese on their drive towards the Dutch East Indies. My life with the anti-aircraft company became one constant whirl of action, setting up guns to protect bridges or other strategic points as our troops retreated to Bataan. We seemed to move all night and fire at the Jap planes all day. Our rations became less and less as the weeks passed. We ate all the horses and mules from the 26th Cavalry. Even General Wainwright's companion jumper was sacrificed."
In February 1942, with the Japanese closing in, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to escape to Australia. MacArthur at first considered resigning his commission and staying to fight, but his staff talked him out of it. On March 12th, MacArthur and a small group escaped on 4 PT boats. They were picked up by the U.S. Navy and eventually reached Australia. On arriving in Australia, MacArthur made his famous "I shall return" speech.
"The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary objective of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through and I shall return."
It would take years, but General MacArthur would return, and he would recapture the Philippines. He would also receive the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. MacArthur was one of many generals who would attain a legendary status during World War II. General George C. Marshall was Army Chief of Staff throughout the war. Though he didn't lead troops into combat, he skillfully managed the largest military expansion in U.S. history, a 40-fold increase in just 3 years. By the end of April 1945, over 3 million U.S. Army soldiers would be fighting in the European theater of operations and 1.2 million in the Pacific theater, where another 1.4 million sailors were also serving. He developed a strategy that would guide Allied operations in Europe, and in December 1944 became the first American general promoted to 5-star rank. General George S. Patton commanded forces in North Africa, Sicily, and the European theater. Following the Normandy invasion in 1944, he was given command of the U.S. Third Army. His temper and speech could get him in trouble, but he was a master of logistics. His planning and audacity helped him lead his force to victory at the Battle of the Bulge. General Omar Bradley was much less colorful than Patton, but he commanded the U.S. First Army on D-Day in the Omaha and Utah beachhead landings and planned Operation Cobra, which allowed the Allies to break out of Normandy and into Brittany. And then there was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1942, he was made Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the North African Theater of Operations. After the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa in 1943, Eisenhower became the Supreme Allied Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Generals Patton, Bradley, and others reported to him as he planned and guided operations to the end of the war. But as critical as the generals are to planning, the wars are won by the soldiers and their front-line officers. Men like Lieutenant Vernon Baker of the 370th Infantry, 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. Lieutenant Baker would receive the Medal of Honor for actions taking place near the end of the war, over April 5th and 6th, 1945, near Viareggio, Italy. Lieutenant Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions over those 2 days, presented to him on July 4th, 1945. And over 50 years later, President Clinton presented him with the Medal of Honor. Vernon Baker remained in the Army until 1968. He returned stateside in 1947, where he continued to face racism within and outside of the military. But on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, declaring that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was only a step, but a large one, on the path to recognizing the contributions that African American soldiers made to the military and to the nation. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Division had proven, as other African American soldiers had done in every previous war, that honor and courage are not measured in color. Nor was honorable service limited to men of any color. Women had supported the military throughout its history, though they were usually not permitted in combat. Some women dressed as men so that they could fight in the American Revolution. Women like Dr. Mary Walker risked their lives to provide medical treatment to soldiers in the Civil War, as in all wars. But in May 1942, Congress, led by Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers, created the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. In July 1943, they were converted from auxiliary to full Army status in the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. WACs served in a variety of assignments: weather forecasters, electrical specialists, sheet metal workers, control tower specialists, airplane mechanics, radio mechanics, parachute rigging, surgical technicians, and more. Women of the Women's Army Corps were awarded 639 medals for service during World War II, including the Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Soldier's Medal, Bronze Star, Air Medal, and the Purple Heart. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948 made the Women's Army Corps a part of the regular armed forces, and in July 1948, the first enlisted woman entered the regular army. But while the number of women in the Army may have been rising, the overall size of the Army was shrinking rapidly. The Axis powers surrendered in the summer of 1945, and America was ready to bring the troops home. But veterans were returning home to a grateful nation. The GI Bill in 1944 provided a range of benefits to returning soldiers, including low-cost mortgages, business loans, tuition assistance, and up to a year of unemployment compensation. By 1956, over 2 million veterans had used the GI benefits to go to college or university, and almost 7 million more used the benefits for other training. Meanwhile, the country of Korea was coming out from under 40 years of control by Imperial Japan and was being split apart between communist forces in the north and nationalist forces in the south. The nation was split in half at the 38th parallel. In the south, the U.S. maintained a small number of military advisors. The Soviets dominated the northern half, which was filled with communist Korean soldiers who had just helped Mao Zedong's forces take control of China. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, with Soviet and Chinese approval, invaded South Korea. The U.S. convinced the UN Security Council to establish a United Nations Command, or UNC, to defend South Korea under the leadership of the U.S. and General Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur planned a bold and brilliant amphibious assault at Incheon to take back the South. Incheon was the port for Seoul, 18 miles inland, and was the closest possible landing site to the capital, and the communications center was there.
The history of war proves that 9 out of 10 times an army has been destroyed because its supply lines have been cut off. We shall land at Incheon, and I shall crush them.
The Joint Chiefs in Washington were doubtful of his plan, but MacArthur's gamble paid off. The daring assault was a tremendous success. By September 23rd, North Korea was in retreat from the Pusan perimeter. And on September 29th, 1950, MacArthur reported,
"By the grace of a merciful providence, our forces fighting under the standard of that greatest hope and inspiration of mankind, the United Nations, have liberated this ancient city of Seoul."
The Incheon offensive succeeded in driving the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. But in late November, attacks by all Chinese forces hammered units of the United Nations Command. The Soviets provided air support for any battles in communist territory, and UNC forces in North Korea began to fold, and MacArthur ordered a withdrawal. In late December, a new commander under MacArthur took over the battered 8th Army, General Matthew Ridgway. He restored confidence in his troops, pushing officers to the front lines and out of the rear command posts. Under Ridgway, the 8th Army inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy and recaptured Seoul in March 1951. When MacArthur was relieved of command by Truman in April, Ridgway was promoted to full general and took command of the UN forces. In August 1953, with hostilities in Korea ended, Ridgway became the Army Chief of Staff under President Eisenhower. In that role, he was asked to give Eisenhower an assessment of what would be required for U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Ridgway's conclusion was that a massive commitment would be required to achieve the nation's goals in Vietnam. Massive enough that Eisenhower determined not to intervene. In fact, during the 1950s, military expansion, due to the Cold War, was focused on air power and nuclear superiority, to the point that conventional forces began to suffer from outdated equipment and reduced budgets. But advances in the tools of conventional warfare did not halt. The M60 battle tank, with its 105mm gun, became operational in 1960. The Army also expanded its use of helicopters, which had already proved their value in Korea and would again in Vietnam. And the Army also took advantage of the improvements in communications technology and, eventually, computers. Those technological changes were coming as part of the space race, and the Army had a role here, too. Several of the earliest astronauts were graduates of the United States Military Academy at West Point, including Frank Borman, the first man to orbit the moon, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, and Edward White, the first American to perform a spacewalk. But as defense expenditures in the 1960s rose, policymakers looked for places to cut. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara sought to reduce the size of the reserve forces, which seemed more expensive than their value. There was resistance in Congress and elsewhere, but eventually, in 1967, a compromise was reached that achieved most of what McNamara wanted. The reserves retained their support and training units, but lost all but 3 combat brigades, bringing their overall size down to 260,000. The National Guard remained at 400,000 men. To augment the regular forces in Vietnam, as it had in World Wars I and II and Korea, the U.S. relied on the Selective Service Draft. The first major conflict of the Vietnam War was the Battle of Ya Drang, beginning with the battle at Landing Zone X-Ray. In the week before Thanksgiving, in 1965, the U.S. Army came head-to-head with the North Vietnamese Army for the first time. It was a battle that would lead to 3 separate Medals of Honor. North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, regiments had attempted the destruction of a U.S. Special Forces camp, and the 1st Cavalry Division was pursuing them. On November 14th, 1965, this pursuit led the 7th Cavalry Regiment's 1st Battalion to the Ya Drang Valley on a search and destroy mission. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore entered the valley first with members of his Bravo Company. 16 helicopters shuttled Bravo Company into Landing Zone X-Ray on the northeast side of Chu Pong Mountain. They would secure the landing zone and await the battalion's Alpha, Charlie, and Delta companies. From the air, LZ X-Ray looked flat and open. On the ground, it was a different matter. The landing zone was covered with elephant grass, up to 5 feet high, perfect for hiding enemy soldiers. Enormous anthills dotted the area, large enough to provide cover for weapons units. Colonel Moore knew that the enemy had forces in this area. What he didn't know was that 3 regiments of the NVA were gathered nearby. Far more soldiers than the 1 company he had managed to bring in so far. The Americans received an alert to the size of the forces they would be facing when Bravo's 1st platoon discovered an unarmed NVA deserter. When questioned, he reported that there were 3 NVA battalions on Chu Pong Mountain, and they were anxious to kill American soldiers. As Bravo Company intensified their search for enemy units, Alpha Company, including Alpha's 2nd platoon leader, Lieutenant Joe Marm, landed and secured the landing zone. Bravo Company's 1st platoon was hit by an enemy force of about equal size a little after noon. Flanked on both sides, the platoon radioed for help. Colonel Moore's battalion was being hit hard, all over LZ X-Ray. The 5th airlift of the day, carrying the last of Charlie Company and the lead elements of Delta, was only able to land half of its helicopters. Mortar, rocket, and machine gun fire were so intense that Colonel Moore radioed the remaining 8 choppers not to land. They suffered attacks throughout the night, but units from the 1st and 2nd battalions would reach them the following day. In Vietnam, the Army and its commanding General William Westmoreland were forced to fight under strict limitations. They did not have the authority to strike at enemy bases in Laos or Cambodia or enter North Vietnam. Westmoreland believed that the U.S. could wear the North Vietnamese down through attrition, using the Army's superior firepower and mobility to ensure that the heaviest losses fell on the enemy. At the end of 1967, it seemed that he might be right. The momentum of the war seemed to be favoring the U.S. But the Tet Offensive, beginning on January 30th, 1968, changed the public's attitude towards the war. Tactically, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces defeated the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attackers. But the political impact was devastating. The public had been led to believe that the communist enemy was incapable of an attack like the massive, widespread, organized Tet Offensive. They reacted with shock and distrust, unwilling to believe that the assault had truly been a defeat for the enemy. Public support for the war continued to drop. Westmoreland was replaced by General Creighton Abrams as commander in Vietnam, but then served as Army Chief of Staff until 1972. Though the war dragged on, that support never returned. When the Army left Vietnam in the 1970s, it was at a low point. Racial tensions, heroin addiction, and the desperate desire to not be the last man to die in Vietnam had all dealt the military a harsh blow. Discipline was terrible. Morale was worse. The end of the war did not mean the end of problems, but eliminating the draft and establishing an all-volunteer army would prove an important step in the right direction. An all-volunteer force would be better paid and better treated, while soldiers in an army with the unlimited manpower provided by the draft might be given menial, non-military duties that could sap morale. A smaller, better-paid force could not afford to waste its highly trained fighting men. This meant fewer soldiers, to be sure. The Army shrank from its Vietnam high of 1.6 million in 1968 to fewer than 800,000 in 1974. This meant a greater reliance than ever on the reserves. This was the total force policy. The three components of the Army, regular Army, reserves, and National Guard, would be treated as a single force. The Volunteer Army also meant a more expansive policy toward women. In 1978, there were 53,000 women in the Army. By '83, that was up to 80,000. Training for women was greatly improved and began to include training in small arms. Then, in the year of the nation's 200th birthday, over 100 women were admitted to the military academy at West Point. The Women's Army Corps was no more. These women were soldiers. And this process continued, with individual units including both men and women. By 1990, when the Army went to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, almost 9% were women. The Gulf War was the first major operation for the Army since Vietnam. Despite participation in operations in El Salvador, Grenada, and Panama, the Army was largely untested over the previous 2 decades. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, there was much talk about shrinking the military, no longer needed now that its enemy was gone. Its overwhelming success against Iraq in 1990 through 91 would demonstrate to the world that the U.S. maintained the finest fighting force on earth. After Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, America's first priority became the defense of Saudi Arabia. General Norman Schwarzkopf, Jr., Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, had recently developed a contingency plan for the defense of the oil fields of the Persian Gulf in the case of invasion by Iraq, and that plan became the basis for Operation Desert Shield, the defense of Saudi Arabia. A few months later, Schwarzkopf's offensive plan, Desert Storm, pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. After the Gulf War, the Army performed missions in Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia. International missions with the U.S. Army taking a major role. During this period, the Army downsized by a third, while nonetheless being active overseas. With the enemies a half-century gone, the Army was developing more and more the capability to go anywhere and do anything, rather than focus entirely on Cold War struggles. Then, on September 11th, 2001, the world changed. The Al-Qaeda attacks on the homeland shook the nation and reoriented the military toward a prolonged war against non-state actors. A war of both defense and offense. National Guardsmen augmented the security of airports around the country. Soldiers were deployed to assist agencies such as the U.S. Border Patrol. And in less than a month, Operation Enduring Freedom began with a series of air and missile strikes against Taliban command and control targets, combined with humanitarian food drops to demonstrate that the U.S. was at war with the government, not the people of Afghanistan. In November 2001, the Taliban was forced to flee from Kabul. But the fight was far from over. The war in Afghanistan would become America's longest-running war. As of 2012, American forces are still fighting in Afghanistan. And while the long, deadly mission in Afghanistan continued, the U.S. also returned to an old foe, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. U.S. Army General Tommy Franks led an invasion into Iraq on March 19, 2003. Just a few weeks later, on April 9th, Baghdad fell to U.S. and coalition forces, ending Saddam Hussein's 24-year rule. But, as with Afghanistan, the war in Iraq did not end with the collapse of the belligerent government. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, America's armed forces have faced a long, deadly fight against insurgent forces. In Afghanistan and Iraq, our soldiers continue to demonstrate the courage and determination that they have shown for over 200 years. Soldiers like Army Sergeant First Class Paul Smith in Iraq. Sergeant Smith was killed in April 2003 when he exposed himself to the enemy as he and fellow soldiers were attacked while building a prisoner of war holding area. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation reads, "Fearing the enemy would overrun their defenses, Sergeant First Class Smith moved under withering enemy fire to man a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a damaged armored personnel carrier. In total disregard for his own life, he maintained his exposed position in order to engage the attacking enemy force. During this action, he was mortally wounded." Private First Class Ross Mcginnis also earned the Medal of Honor, received posthumously, for choosing to put his body between a fragmentation grenade and his fellow soldiers in Iraq in December 2006. In November 2010, Army Staff Sergeant Salvador Junta was presented with his Medal of Honor for actions in Afghanistan on October 25, 2007. In May 2008, Army Staff Sergeant Leroy Petry and his 2 fellow Rangers had been wounded by enemy fire and shrapnel from a grenade. When a second grenade landed among them, Staff Sergeant Petry, with complete disregard to his own safety, scooped up the grenade and threw it away from his fellow Rangers. The grenade detonated as he released it, amputating his right hand at the wrist and further injuring him with multiple shrapnel wounds. These soldiers, and the tens of thousands of men and women fighting in America's Army today, continue to provide an inspiration to Americans young and old. They remind us all that freedom isn't free, that America has enemies that must be fought, and that we are honored to have American soldiers volunteer to be the shield and sword that defends us all. In its more than 2 centuries of existence, the Army has stood against enemies both foreign and domestic. Composed of both professional warriors and citizen soldiers, the Army won the nation's liberty from Great Britain. It defended settlers from attacks by indigenous tribes that were often supported by European nations. It defeated insurrectionist forces from the short-lived Confederate States of America. It supported our allies while defending our own interests abroad, and it proved our willingness and ability to resist Soviet and communist expansion. And it followed our enemies to every corner of the earth.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.